There is a curious and not altogether comfortable verse in Ecclesiastes chapter 4 verse 1. Again, I saw all the oppressions that are practiced under the sun, and behold the tears of the oppressed, and there was no one to comfort them. And on the side of the oppressors there was power, and no one to comfort them. All throughout God's word, all throughout Scripture, the poor, the orphan, the widow, the sick, the outcast, the refugee, the foreigner, the marginalized, from every avenue and corner of society, is a recipient of God's special grace and compassion and love. And we are encouraged to do exactly the same, to see, to comfort. But what about the oppressor? Why would we be concerned about the oppressor? One of the most shocking revelations that we find in Jesus' message was the understanding that we as human beings, all of us, are at some point in our lives the oppressed and the oppressor. It is a truth about the nature of human beings. All of us can point to some kind of injustice or unfairness. All of us can cry victim and say how we might have been poorly treated. But all of us are also perpetrators of injustice, oppressors, whether deliberately, volitionally, willfully, which is a horrifying thought. But all of us, even tacitly, in some unquestioning, unthinking way, failing to challenge, accepting and participating in the world and society around us that has been built on centuries of injustice and oppression. And even in that regard, we are participating as oppressors. But all of us, if we're honest with ourselves, can identify truthfully with the idea that yes, we have been victims in our life, but we have also in our thoughts and in our words and in our deeds oppressed, marginalized, participated in some sense in injustice towards other people. And that is an uncomfortable thought. But it also might challenge the idea that simply punishing perpetrators of injustice, simply seeing oppressors get their just deserts, might not be the whole story. It's tempting to say, who cares about those who have oppressed? Who cares? They get what they deserve. So what if they've not been comforted? Jesus had a remarkable way of bringing a message to both the oppressed and the oppressor at the same time, and presenting them both with the opportunity to be set free from their oppression, set free from their oppressing. As a sort of precursor to the Passion of the Christ, a prelude, if you like, to Jesus' journey towards the cross, we find some remarkable stories on the road to Jericho, or from Jericho to Jerusalem. Jesus, if you like, physically is making a journey in the stories that we read in the Gospels. And that is an overlay, if you like, onto his spiritual journey, his journey towards the cross, the reason that he came. And along the way, he meets several people, one of whom I'll speak to you about this morning. And next week, we'll look at another couple of examples. So imagine then, Jesus is on the way to a town called Jericho. And he has a sort of entourage with him. He's amassed some reputation. He's famous now, this carpenter rabbi from Nazareth. Famous for his message, famous for his miracles, famous for his deeds, and famous for the kind of people that he ministered to, who again were often the marginalized, the most marginalized in society, but also because he also took on those who were the oppressors. And not in the way that everybody wanted him to. Jesus, as a Jew, was a part of a nation of people who themselves were oppressed. They were subjects of the Roman Empire. And when Jesus came along, as did others before him, the first thing that people often looked for was this guy going to be their champion who would overthrow or support their resistance to the empire? We are the oppressed. We are the victims. Are you going to help us deal with the oppressors? And Jesus brings a message that highlights not just their oppression, but also that they themselves were oppressors. Now, in the Middle East, village people would show honor to important guests by walking some distance to the edge of their town and beyond, so that they could meet their guests and escort them into their village. In fact, the popularity of celebrities was measured in how far people were willing to walk outside of their town to greet their guests and escort them in. As an example, in the early 1960s, President Nasser of Egypt, at the height of his power, visited a town called Aswad, and the townsfolk there walked 10 miles outside of their town to greet the president's entourage. They encouraged the entourage to switch off the engines of their vehicles. The townsfolk tied ropes to the bumpers of the car, and by hand, they pulled the vehicles as a sign of honor and respect into the town. So Jesus is on his way to the town of Jericho, and a crowd in a similar fashion comes out to greet him. There's a big crowd on the road to greet Jesus. They had already heard of his coming, and they had already begun to prepare a feast that the whole village would have participated in, preparing for, and they would have expected him to have stayed the night, celebrate with them, and at the same time, they would have sat him down and they would have tried to ascertain where his allegiances lay. Because if this was going to be somebody who could help them overthrow the Romans, or at the very least, they would want to know where his political persuasions lay, and could they count on him to support their particular faction or their particular religious tradition or their particular view of the Roman Empire. And so in order to weed all this out of them, they had prepared this banquet. And all of this agenda and much more besides was involved in them coming to greet their guest, preparing a banquet for them, welcoming. So on the road to Jericho, with this large crowd gathered, there's a beggar. And the beggar's name is Bartimaeus, and his name is really interesting. It means son of filth, bizarrely. And this beggar, he calls out to the crowd, or he asks the crowd to begin with, who is this famous person that's coming? Who are you all bustling around? And they tell him that it's Jesus of Nazareth. And the beggar then uses a term, Son of David, which is only used twice of Jesus in the gospel stories. Once by a Syrophoenician woman that you find in the story in Matthew chapter 5, verse 21 through 28, and by this beggar. So this son of filth starts to shout out and call on the Son of David, somebody whose reputation had preceded him and who he knew about. Now, to understand what the beggar was after, it's important to understand the role of the beggar within a society like that. And that might seem like an odd phrase, the role of the beggar. Wasn't this somebody who was marginalized? And in fact, he absolutely was. And a victim of injustice all the time. Not just because he was blind, but also because of his socioeconomic situation, his status. He was kind of reviled by the rest of society and pushed aside. But bizarrely, he had a role within that society to play, which I'll explain. But right away, when he begins to cry out, Son of David, have mercy on me, the crowd want to shut him up. They oppress him. They want to silence him. They want to move him out of the way. This is the sort of shame of the village, the shame of the society. We don't need an important man like Jesus seeing or hearing any of that nonsense. Get him out of the way. But Jesus does something unexpected. He stops, he silences the crowd, and then he asks the crowd to bring the man to him. And instantly, what he does is he has the oppressing crowd be the escorts for his guest of honor. So he puts all the attention and spotlight on the man calling Son of David, which had gotten his attention. And they bring him as if servants bringing a guest to the king. And then Jesus says, what do you want me to do for you? Which appears at first blush a bit tasteless, a little bit heartless. The guy's blind Jesus. He's a beggar Jesus. Isn't it obvious? In Middle Eastern societies like this, beggars are a recognized part of the community, and they have a service to offer. Every pious, every religious person within that town is expected as part of their obligations to God to give to the poor. And every pious person needs a poor blind beggar or the like to give to. No poor, no fulfilled duty. You can see the truth of it even in some societies still in parts of the world. When you pass by a beggar on the street, they wouldn't say necessarily, give me some money for food, please. They might say, give to God. And what they're really saying is, here is your opportunity to give to God. Pious people need someone to give their alms to, their donations to, and they need to do it in public. They do it in public for a number of reasons. But in essence, what a poor person or a beggar would say would be, you know what, my needs are beside the point at the moment. I'm giving you the opportunity, pious person, to fulfill one of your obligations to God. Furthermore, this is a public place, and if you give to me here right now, you'll gain a reputation for being an honorable, compassionate, pious person. So I'm doing you a service. I'm helping you fulfill your obligations to God. And this was the way in which they marketed themselves, if you like, in society. So what was the crowd thinking when Jesus calls for the beggar? They're probably thinking he's going to do like all the other religious pious people do. He's going to make a big show of giving the poor person some coin. But here's the interesting part. When a beggar receives alms like that, he would usually stand up, if he could, and proclaim in a loud voice that the giver was the most noble, most pious person that he'd ever met. And then he'd invoke some kind of blessing on the man. Bless the giver, God. Bless his family. Bless his friends. Bless anybody that knows him. Bless his coming and his going. Bless his house. Bless his stuff. Everything that they could do to make a big show of this man's giving of some kind of coin. And he'd go on and he'd go on and he'd go on and he'd go on. And the pious person would be like, oh, stop. And they would feign this kind of humility. The public praise, however, is exactly what the pious person is looking for. And the praise is the least that the beggar can give in exchange for the offering, typically minuscule, that the person would have given them. The difficulty with that kind of profession is that some kind of physical handicap is required. Sadly, the more physically unable you are, the more likely you're to get the attention of these pious people, and the more likely you are to receive these small offerings. And a blind person virtually guaranteed success in that respect. And like many other people in his position, these people were oppressed in such a way that they had no other option but to live a life of begging. They had no other prospects for income or support. And so that was the life and the only way that they had of feeding themselves, of surviving. And when Jesus comes, as he did often, offering a different kind of scenario, let me not just ply you with a little coin or give you what you're looking for right now, but what are you really looking for? There is a moment when that person thinks, do I really want to be healed? Because if he heals me now, if he makes it so that I can see or makes it so that I can walk again, how am I going to make my living? I'm not going to make any money. I'm going to have to start again. These are the kind of things that would be going through your mind. But Jesus asks the question in order to see where the man's at. Where are you at? What do you really want? So it wasn't just to brush him off, and it wasn't just an ignorance of the very obvious. That was obvious to everybody else. What do you want? Because you've called me son of David. There's clearly something more to this. And in fact, throughout the story, the man goes from using monikers and salutations like Son of God to eventually Lord, a sort of journey of transformation that the man has gone through, recognizing who Jesus is and ultimately what he can do for him. But again, the important element in this story is that Jesus doesn't just address the man as any other pious or religious person would do. He brings the oppressing crowd in so that he can simultaneously show the injustice that he has received and that they are perpetrating, maybe even daily in this man's life or similar people like him. So he's correcting, slapping the wrist, verbally if you like, of the crowd, and he's also giving his full attention to the injustices that the man has then received and all of the injustices that have gone in to putting the man in that position. So Jesus' exam of the beggar, if you like, his questioning, presses this issue of responsibility and acceptance. Are you prepared for what I can offer you? Are you really prepared for what I can do for you? Because I'm not your normal person here, bringing just a little bit of coin. I can turn your life around. I can make it so that that burden, that injustice that you were born with, that injustice that was imposed on you by the society in which you grew up, all of that, I can turn around. What do you really, really want? And in one translation, it reads, the beggar says, let me receive my sight that I might see you. And then Jesus says, again, another verbal slap to the oppressing crowd. Look at the faith of this man. What faith? So Jesus sides with the oppressed. The community is the oppressor. Right there, oppressing, but also themselves participating in the whole society. They've been built on oppression, which is something, again, that we'll explore a little bit further in next week's story when we look at Zacchaeus. And Jesus gives them that verbal slap, gets them to think about not just being the victims or the oppressed of the Roman Empire, but they themselves are also oppressing others. You might have a claim to some injustice, but you're also perpetrating injustice. It changes them. Whether perhaps putting on a show, but I think also with some sincerity, the crowd absorbs that and they begin praising God along with the man when Jesus heals the man. So, there's a lot of oppression. It's something that has always been a part of the world in which we live. And it doesn't go away. It certainly doesn't go away easily. And many times the victories over certain injustices that we think have been won have not really been won in the way that we would like. These issues don't end because they are human. And people are born every day. Generation after generation, humanity cycles on and perpetrates the same injustices over and over and over again. And whenever there is power, there's going to be injustice. But one of the ways in which we can deal with that is to begin to recognize that we are as much a perpetrator of injustice as victims of it. God bless you guys. Thanks so much for being a part of what God is doing at Pilgrim Community Church, for watching this video. God bless, take care, look after yourselves, and we'll see you again next week.